President Joe Biden is allowing sanctions to move forward against the company that built the Russia to Germany Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline worth $11 billion and against the company's CEO for its actions against Ukraine. Officials at the U.S. State Department say sanctions against Nord Stream 2 for military moves into eastern Ukraine by President Vladimir Putin are just the beginning of a response by the United States. Here is U.S. State Department spokesman Ned Price.
Always said in the context of Nord Stream 2, in the context of the steps that we are taking with partners and allies around the world, that one of the most important tools we have in our arsenal is transatlantic unity. The fact that Germany acted so quickly, so decisively, is in many ways a product of the coordination, of the consultation. What the Germans did yesterday was to ensure that the pipeline is no longer part of the equation. Right. So by acting together with the Germans, how we did, when we did, and the way in which we did, we have ensured that this is an $11 billion prize investment that is now a hunk of steel sitting at the bottom of the sea.
All right, for more on the latest developments in the Russia invasion of Ukraine, we're going to cross over to London, our Rise TV studios in London, and join global correspondent Carl Bostic. Carl, good afternoon. Thanks so much for joining us. So what is the latest developments so far with regards to this invasion?
Well, once you get beyond just the shock that this invasion has already started. In fact, Vladimir Putin doesn't call it an invasion. He calls it a special military operation. This is the beginning of a war of what could be the worst fighting since the Second World War, which ended in 1945, with 190,000 troops amassed on the border of Ukraine, now seeking to move across the border into Ukraine, and there are reports of fighting. You've had national leaders in Europe making TV addresses expressing their sorrow, their anger. I found France's Emmanuel Macron showing a lot of anger. He said that this marks a turning point in the history of Europe and the history of our country. He said that there will be consequences and sanctions imposed which are commensurate with the aggression that Russia is guilty of. And coming from Macron, it's very, very striking because more than any other foreign leader, he's the one who met with Vladimir Putin the most, and he was really the unofficial interlocutor for the West, apart from President Joe Biden, even meeting him for 5 hours. And he was trying to even broker a summit between Biden and Putin. So for him, it was really almost kind of a betrayal of sorts, a slap in the face, an insult, as though diplomacy was never really seriously being considered. You've got the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg saying that peace on our continent has been shattered. And he says that this was a cold-blooded, deliberate, long-planned action by Vladimir Putin. And that's why tomorrow you'll have multiple summits taking place. You'll have a G7 summit. There will be an European Council summit, and there will be a NATO summit as well to coordinate their response, as in the words French President Macron says, that are commensurate with the acts of aggression that Russians are guilty of. So we should see a very, very massive, serious response tomorrow.
Carl, so look, there's been lots of talk about Russia's U.S. dollar reserves and gold reserves. I think we have a chart there. It's about $630 billion worth, which has been suggested that it's possible that Russia could ride out these sanctions due to the amount of reserves that they have. Are the economic sanctions effective enough, Carl, in your estimate?
Well, in the short term, no. Meaning that if this is a short-term crisis, let's say, for example, if Ukraine falls or Kiev, the capital, falls, those sanctions won't have as much of a bite as they would if it becomes a protracted conflict. What's noteworthy is this. You mentioned that $600 billion figure. That's the central bank. That's its reserves. So you could liken that to a war chest. The most notable feature is really this. Since the Crimea invasion of 2014, Russia, you could say, has learned its lesson from nearly 100 sanctions that were imposed on individuals and entities, oligarchs with the Russian government, with many more now slated to carry out. I say that because what they've done is they've steadily reduced their exposure to U.S. bonds. Back in 2018 or so, they had about $97 billion in U.S. Treasury bonds. That's now down to $4 billion. What they've done instead is they've increased their holdings of Chinese and Japanese assets. That's what's happened. So they're relying more on that. At the same time, in terms of sanctions that would really take a bite, for example, the banks that have been targeted so far, let's say by the UK or by the U.S., those are not the consumer banks. Those are not the retail banks that consumers use when they go to the ATM and withdraw their cash, or they get paid or get their pensions. The biggest bank is Sberbank. That's Russia's biggest bank. They pay more than they pay the wages and pensions of more than half of Russia's population. If that bank was targeted, for example, let's say Russia was cut off from the international payment system called SWIFT, you would see an immediate impact in the daily lives of Russians where they could not access their funds. At the same time, ironically, if they were cut off from the international payment system, it would actually almost backfire to some extent, would actually have a ricochet effect on European economies because of the dependency on Russian oil and gas. About 35 to 40% of energy needs in Russia energy needs in Europe come from Russia. In Germany, it's about 60%. And when they receive that fuel, gas and oil, they have to then pay for that. But if that international payment system is suspended or cut off, then they can't pay for their oil and gas. And they won't get their oil and gas, and you're still in the midst of a winter. That's the dilemma that everyone's facing right now.
And Carl, we just had a graphic up on military spending, I think top 5, where the United States accounts for almost half of global military spending. Russia, I think, is in 5th or 6th place, no, 4th place. Is military action completely off the table from what you're hearing, Carl?
What's interesting is that, firstly, Ukraine is not a member of NATO. And that was one of the sticking points Vladimir Putin was obsessed with. He was saying that, if Ukraine becomes a member of NATO, then they're threatening Russia's security. And there were even, conspiracy theories being floated that if it joins NATO, that nuclear weapons will be installed on Ukraine's soil. But it's Article 5, that's what Vladimir Putin was most worried about, because it's Article 5 that allows a member country to invoke, if it's attacked, so that other NATO countries are obliged to defend it. But that's not the case because Ukraine is not a member. However, what we've now seen, Article 4 was invoked by NATO member countries, Poland and the Baltic states, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania. And what does Article 4 say? It says that any NATO member country that feels that its territory or independence is under threat of attack or being threatened, that's different than actually being attacked, then they can invoke a consultative meeting for a defensive response. What that would mean, in effect, was basically a ratcheting up of NATO and U.S. troops on the borders of the Baltic countries and the Eastern European countries such as Poland, Romania, and Bulgaria. So that's what we could see. But then finally, keep in mind that this could be a hybrid warfare involving cyber attacks as well. So they also have to guard against that.
Arise Global Correspondent Carl Bostic in our London studio. Thank you so much, Carl, for bringing us up to date on the Russia-Ukraine situation.